Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes even from home. I'm your host, Mike Indivina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indivina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Jonte Knif, and if you're not familiar with him, he owns Knif Audio, which is a manufacturer of high-end mastering-grade equipment. They make EQs, compressors, they even make microphones, synthesizers. They actually make a lot of equipment that might not be used specifically for mastering, but it is definitely made to a super high quality, all handmade stuff. And you might even be familiar with some of his products because there are a couple plug-in alliance versions of his hardware units. There is his Soma, which is an amazing mastering EQ. And then there's also the Knifonium, which is a really cool tube-based synthesizer. In this chat, we have a really interesting conversation about the process of manufacturing gear and what that looks like and how to build gear that has a specific level of quality that stands above the rest. And really, the interesting part of this conversation to me is the debate of what makes a sound good. And as you'll hear in this interview, I think that that's something that as a manufacturer, Jonte has to deal with all the time is, understanding when your equipment is done versus when you need to optimize it more. And, what sounds good, what sounds better, that kind of thing. There's a lot of subjectivity to audio. And as a manufacturer, you have to balance that subjectivity to decide what ultimately sounds really good for you and what you're happy with putting out. So yeah, in this conversation, we definitely talk about that and how he balances this in his own work. We also get into some really interesting conversations about what makes different models of equipment different. Obviously, when it comes to your plugins or your hardware, whatever it is that you tend to use, you've probably got a lot of options out there for different EQs, different compressors, that kind of stuff. So what ultimately makes these things different? Because sometimes, once you learn how these controls operate, it sounds like they should all kind of function the same way. But the reality is that some people prefer certain pieces of gear versus others because they have a specific sound to them. So what makes these EQs different or what makes these different pieces of equipment different? And that's something we definitely cover in this interview here too as well. Now, I will say that this conversation definitely gets a little technical at some points here. After all, we are dealing with the person who understands all of the electronics behind all of this stuff. But I will say that even if you aren't a really technical electronics-based person, I think it is really helpful to listen through this conversation to get a new appreciation for what actually goes into the equipment and why things sound different and how all of the little components that go into this equipment really add up to the sound that we're used to hearing. So, yeah, if you're not technical and you don't necessarily know some of these words, not a problem, but pay attention to the things that keep popping up because those are important things that you should probably research a little bit more to just get more familiar with because ultimately in the end, when you're looking for new equipment to purchase and that kind of stuff, you want to be making decisions with an understanding of these components because ultimately they are the thing that differentiate the quality between different units out there. So that's enough of my rambling for now. Let's just jump right into this interview because I think it's a really fun conversation. I think it's really interesting and you're going to learn a lot from it. Jonte Knif, thank you so much for being on the Master Mix podcast. How's it going, man?
I'm great today and I'm very pleased to be here.
Awesome. I appreciate that. For people who might not know you, who aren't familiar with your background, both in music and in manufacturing and all the cool stuff that you're working on, can you give us that story?
Yeah, well, I was always interested in audio and electronics, but I never really studied formally. I first tried to be a musician and I studied in Helsinki in the Sibelius Academy for around 6 years, mostly baroque music, but we also played with friends, all kinds of weird stuff. But then I had to give up with the music because of too many physical problems, and then the following year, I started the studies in the Department of Music Technology, also in the same university. And then I managed to actually graduate, and for a while I didn't know what to do, but because I had already been building some crude compressor, mic preamp, something like that, and also loudspeakers. Then I kind of drifted and started to build these things to friends first, and then I founded the company, and then it took many years to get really good. I mean, I was autodidact, self-taught mostly.
That's amazing. Yeah. So what got you into the tech side of things? And like, was it just because, you appreciated the gear or something like that made you interested in that? Or were you always a bit of a techie kind of person?
Yeah, the last one, I think.
Yeah.
I was always a bit nerd and techie, and making music, making musical instruments, always also a big part of my life. Designing acoustic instruments, still doing it every now and then. Also next summer we have a couple of projects with friends, and recording, but not so much recording, mixing and producing, that kind of things. I really didn't have time to properly get into that. So, but sometimes I record some classical music things for a few friends.
That's very cool. It's interesting because, you were saying you didn't really get into like the recording side of it, but yet you make amazing gear for that purpose. So, I'd love to talk about that. Like, obviously it's one thing to build instruments, especially if you're, you have a background in performing music yourself, there's that practical side of being able to have that musicianship and play it. But like building equipment for a field that maybe, you didn't have a lot of experience in, what was that? Mentally, was that a bit of a shift for you to focus on that kind of stuff?
I think it just happened somehow. I didn't really concentrate on any long-term plans. It just happened, really. But I still have a great friend who is a recording engineer, mixing engineer, and also designs loudspeakers, who was interested in electronics at the same time, and we had sessions. We studied together. We built prototypes together when we were around, let's say, 26 to 30 years old, or something like that. And he remained a mixing engineer, and then I became a manufacturer, little by little.
That's cool. I guess that makes sense. If you have someone that you can bounce ideas off of, or they're like, oh, the tech side of things, and I'm looking for equipment that can do this purpose or that kind of thing. Like,
yeah, and I'm only now, really, last few years, I've begun to understand something about how people use the stuff, and I can actually even hear some of the things. Like lately, we were testing a new compressor model, which is going to be, it's sort of half official already, but it's not on the website, and we will have to wait a few months for the production. But anyway, I tested it here, and I invited a couple of friends to test it also. For the first time, perhaps, I really understood why it was good. It somehow the versatility. I could use very different time constants and ratios and whatever, and somehow I just couldn't make it sound broken. And this has been now confirmed by so many people after that I'm kind of happy that, well, I can hear something. Yeah.
That's interesting. So when you first started building this stuff, then was it a matter of just maybe looking at other schematics for other pieces of gear and then, basing things off of that as your foundation and then customizing from there?
Yeah, to a certain extent, yes. But I didn't go through so many schematics as one might probably think. I had like one modern compressor schematic and one old EQ, or maybe two old EQ schematics, and one opto, like LA2A, and then I had some very interesting, like inspiring old stuff to be repaired. So like RCA compressor from the 50s, which inspired me especially in the way they built those times, like how to make gear easy to maintain, like bomb-proof and that sort of things, because they are mostly lost now, these old practices, or let's say kind of military type of practices to build stuff. People are more cost conscious nowadays, and not everything can be built to the same standards.
For sure. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm very fascinated with the idea of people who manufacture gear that, weren't doing it themselves, and how you learn that stuff, and how you learn to build it, but then how you learn to modify it so that it gets to that standard that it needs to be for the industry that it's being used in, right?
Yeah.
And there's plenty of examples of people in the same situation as you, right? Like, I'm pretty sure Rupert Neve wasn't a recording engineer himself either, right? So, another great example of someone there. So that's very, very cool. So when you were learning the technical side of it, you did mention that you went to a technical school for it, but you were mainly self-taught. So how did you, what did you get from the schooling versus what you learned on your own? Like, were you just kind of on your own, just ripping gear apart and kind of seeing what happened?
Well, from the music technology studies, I got just a general view in the studios, and many good friends who would then later help me to decide what kind of features to incorporate to the gear and so on. But my studies, how I studied electronics, I read suspiciously little. Like, I had Horowitz and Hill, the classic electronic. What's the name of the book now? I somehow lost it. Anyway, it's like the Bible for analog electronics. So I bought it, of course, and read it through. But mainly, I started to play with simulation. So I got a microcap electronic simulator, and I got some tube models into it. I started to design amps and EQs, and I've learned these things, let's say, a bit wrong. I never learned, like, calculus, how to design some EQ circuits on paper with just a calculator and so on. It's been more like, let's put these things in the simulation and try to understand what happens. But one can get actually pretty deep with that method also.
Interesting.
I would say. Yeah.
That's very fascinating. Yeah, as someone who the only electronic background that I have myself is, getting those like DIY kits that you can buy, and those are more or less just soldering by numbers, but to actually understand how everything actually comes together, and understanding how all the components influence each other and all that. I think that's a whole other level of interesting. It makes you really connect with that gear and fully understand what makes it different than other pieces.
The most difficult thing is how to understand what sounds good, because these things are so subtle sometimes, so unbelievably subtle. What will make or break the sound, and we have too little understanding in psychoacoustics. By the way, that is one of the things I really, really loved in my studies, the acoustics and psychoacoustic studies. That gave me a lot.
For people who might not be familiar with like what you're talking about when you're talking about psychoacoustics, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's mainly about how we hear, how the ear works, how the neural network probably crudely works, and then how to research the topic, like what kind of tests have been done, what have been found out, how is timbre and pitch and volume, loudness related, and these kind of things. What is the shortest sound you can hear apart from another, and it's super fascinating.
Gotcha. Because I guess there's like a technical spec that would show you that we should be hearing things one way, but our ears react to the music a different way sometimes, right? And that's kind of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, and there is there is very little research into this kind of very high-end hearing. I mean, the research which is available or was available for us that time, it was really, really basic. It was like, yeah, we know that about 1% of second harmonic distortion sounds maybe a bit more warm and gives nice presence and blah, blah, blah. That's like the closest I got with designing tube gear. But it gave me understanding about how unbelievably complex hearing is, how things interact. Also, like I understood that, okay, this is just such a small niche to really understand what goes into superb sound quality or certain kind of sound quality, that it will never be researched thoroughly. So there's all kinds of riddles and mysteries, and it's somehow very frustrating because then it's impossible to really know sometimes where to go, what to believe, what to try to achieve in the design. But yeah, it's a complicated world, and one life is not enough. Really.
That's very fascinating, especially hearing it from a gear manufacturer, because, yeah, I mean, you know, you out of everyone would have a better understanding of like these little components, and yeah, you're kind of constantly hearing like, you know, seeing the technical side of it and how the perfection should be done there versus what people are actually perceiving it to sound like and this and that. So it's interesting to hear that kind of perspective from it. And I would imagine that just over the years of building gear, I mean, you've probably found that there's certain components that lead to, you know, quote unquote, like high quality component or high quality sound and that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise, there's obviously a reason why you're using certain pieces versus other ones, and, you know, what makes your gear different than others, right?
Yeah, and unfortunately, some of those decisions are a bit more into the black magic than science. So I also try to find relevant information, I mean, credible reviews about some things from the high-end community, which is, of course, totally nuts. But but I mean, also I've been sometimes a bit disappointed in the professional community mainly because people listen with such a bad speakers mainly that they have no chance to hear some of the finesses, delicacies which are available for those who are lucky to have better speakers or phones. It's a constant battle or almost a conflict.
Mm-hmm.
The high-end community skeptical sometimes about the professional audio guys because they obviously use monitoring systems which are not capable of delivering all the resolution. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, then studio guys obviously notice very easily that the high-end community people don't care about gross colorations, sometimes like really, really badly designed stuff and obvious snake oil and so on. The list is long, but it's like sometimes I wish the pro audio community had a possibility to listen to more really good speakers, because they don't, even quite old people don't sometimes know what they have missed, because they always listen to brand X loudspeakers because they were the best they heard. So I don't know.
That's interesting. It's a really fascinating debate because, yeah, who's right in this? You know, like, the majority of the world listens to music on subpar speakers, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be aiming to make our music sound the highest quality. It absolutely can be, but there's also that struggle of like, well, how far do we need to push ourselves, and as far as equipment and as far as all of that stuff to make music please this small niche group of people that dedicate their lives to high quality audio, right?
That's correct, and I understand it also very well. But sometimes it's also about simply not knowing what is possible.
Fair. That's true. It's like once you know that it's possible, then you have that need to like pursue it even further, I guess.
Yeah, but I've had many nice evenings here in my workshop. I have treated this listening room kind of space quite well, and I have a couple of pairs of very high quality speaker designs of my own. And when studio engineers visit the place, quite seasoned one even mastering engineers can be quite surprised about the resolution.
Yeah, interesting. Well, one thing I was curious to know was that I saw on like your company focuses on making high quality mastering grade equipment. That's how I believe you advertise it on your website. How would you define the difference between gear that is made for mastering studios versus mixing studios? Or am I maybe misinterpreting what you mean by mastering grade?
Yeah. In my opinion, repeatability is quite important. So rotary switches mainly or exclusively instead of potentiometers. That's one of the basic things. And kind of tool-like attitude, not aiming for very, very good ergonomics so that people don't have to concentrate on using the gear, but they can become one with it. On the sound, how should they sound? That's then more subjective, and there are different needs. But I have decided to build fairly neutral stuff because there seemed to be an obvious market gap for tube gear, which would be a bit more universal, less colored, more accurate. And maybe that suits my mentality also better. I don't know. On the other hand, then I have obviously built hugely colorful things like the Knifonium synthesizer. So it's not that I wouldn't enjoy making tubes distort the hell out of it, but not in mastering equipment in that way.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And especially the recallability, I think that is a really good distinguishing factor between a lot of mastering grade stuff versus mixing. Because, you want to be able to quickly recall it and know you're exactly with the settings you had before and not like slightly off, because all that stuff does make a difference, right? Every time you play it back, it's going to be slightly different if you've changed that gear up a little bit. So, I think that's a really great differentiator. Because, you see those terms thrown around, mastering grade or whatever. And some people will look at it and be like, is this just like a buzzword, or is there actually like a practical reason why this is a mastering grade thing, right?
Mm.
And obviously, the gear that you use in mastering can certainly be used in mixing. It's just, it works for both, right?
Yeah, obviously.
So it doesn't really make as big of a difference as a lot of people would think, but maybe mastering is typically going to involve a little bit more transparency and a little bit less pushing of the equipment sometimes, right?
Yeah. And certainly maybe 30% or 20% of the gear we have made is in mixing studios.
For sure. Obviously, there's a lot of great recording equipment out there, a lot of great mastering equipment out there. And I'm curious to know, like, what made you decide to start building your own equipment then? Because once you get into the manufacturing side of things, I mean, there's a million different things you can make. So why get into specifically building some of your own audio equipment and, making the models that you did?
That's a tough question. Whoa. Okay, so one part of the equation is that I was just super interested to try if I could be successful. But then I also noticed that I have quite different ideas about some things, and I thought that I could have a twist of my own. And there is, like I said previously, there seemed to be a gap for high quality tube gear, which is not too colorful, too coloring. And I don't know, but I was I was the first in the pro audio who started to use amorphous output transformer cores. That's also something that comes from the high-end community. I had a bit different ideas. And in the beginning, maybe the local community was just so responsive and nice that they ordered my stuff. But then later, I sort of found out that actually I was able to create something that had global possibilities.
Yeah, it eventually caught on. People heard what was possible with it.
Yeah. I never marketed really properly. I was unsure about my skills for a very long time, so I didn't want to rush into international market, and so it happened very slowly. And then after it happened, I kind of had enough work most of the time, and there was no need to try to increase the sales.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that kind of makes sense. And it's fascinating because, I think the way you're describing this, it sounds very similar to what a lot of audio engineers feel like as far as like getting into, opening up studios and stuff like that. It's like that imposter syndrome feeling of like, am I good enough at this? Is like, are my skills there? And sometimes it just takes a little bit of that validation of people actually being like, yes, this sounds great. And that's all you need to just continue to go. And then, it keeps you pushing a little longer, and then eventually you just finesse your craft a little bit, and your skills get stronger, and it keeps improving the quality from that point forward, right?
Yeah, and I'm very happy now that I didn't push it, because the first 10 or so tube compressors I made into Finnish market only, and around the first 6 or 7. They are so badly built that if somebody sells or wants some repairs to be done, I decided that I will offer kind of rebuild.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we changed the circuit boards to thick factory-made proper ones, and I tweaked the circuit to be more easily adjustable and less noisy, but I retained the original sound because that was never an issue. People always liked it a lot.
That's very interesting, but it makes sense, right? It's like, yeah, I think, as a mixing engineer myself, I look back at some of my first projects and it's like, how did I charge people money for that? Like I had to give them their money back, Like I actually even recently, even myself, my very first band that I ever worked with, like however many years ago now, I think it was like 20 years ago. I recently was like, let's record that first song we ever did again, like no charge. Let's just do it. I just want to hear how big of a difference it could be. And it's amazing how like, years later, your craft just gets better and you can look back at it and laugh. But it just takes that initial sale or that initial person who trusts you in the beginning to get the snowball going, right? And to keep you in business essentially. So, sometimes looking back, it can be embarrassing because we know our own strengths now, but we have to look back at those as an experience that pushed us forward, right?
Yeah. And there was no other way. At least I think so. That for me, there was no other way. Finland is not known for many hardware manufacturers. Just these couple loudspeaker brands, obviously, but in the hardware department, not so much. It would have been vastly different situation if I lived in LA or Denmark or one of these really, really strong communities.
Yeah, interesting. One other thing I wanted to ask about was in relation to just, when you start building gear, obviously you kind of did mention that you would start to look at some specs of other existing equipment that was out there. But I'm curious to know, like, let's say, for example, when we're talking about EQ, like what makes one EQ sound different from another? Because to most people, they just learn, well, all you're doing is you're just boosting a certain frequency range by a certain amount of gain and maybe by a certain bandwidth. And all EQs should basically do that, right? So what makes one different than another?
I can give only a partial answer.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think I know everything about that. But there is, like, we can split that question into two. Like, what does it do? And then what does it not do compared to some other? And obviously, for example, Soma does create mainly third harmonic distortion in the bands because there are coils which are slightly nonlinear. So some distortion is created, and that is audible probably, at least in the bass. And what does it not do? Well, at least it doesn't create any crossover distortion like in AB, class AB operational amplifiers. All the distortion is just very, very nice, low harmonic content. So it's sometimes a bit difficult to say, why is the top end, for example, so nice? Why do people think? Why is the middle so unoffensive and high end so smooth and blah, blah, blah? And then I have hard time deciding whether that some very typical IC-based EQ, why does it sound different in the top end? Is it bad or, I mean, objectively bad? Is the small amount of crossover distortion that can be measured, is that really making it sound bad? And it's sometimes a bit hard to believe because the amounts are so low. But I guess I have to kind of believe it because I haven't found other explanations. And also this EXA EQ, which is then very different from Soma. It tries to be totally neutral. It uses my own design, Class A discrete OP amps everywhere. And because it's Class A, there's no crossover distortion. And also, in general, the distortion levels are super, super low. So I kind of cannot find any other reason why it sounds better than some more run-of-the-mill stuff.
Interesting.
And sometimes I really wonder, like, why then does it sound different from good plugins? That's kind of the biggest mystery, because plugin EQs are pretty much perfect. Certainly no distortion in them. So why? Where does it come from? Or even, is it real? Sometimes I think, I wonder whether it really is real. But I guess at this point, when I've sold almost 100, I guess I have to start to believe that people don't spend 8 or 9 grand just to have this
of course
box, which sounds the same as the plugins. Yeah, but it's very, very interesting. I would love to know it.
But you kind of touched on it, I think. Like, I think it's those extra little bits of the harmonic distortion and that kind of stuff that give the hardware some character that can separate it from, like you said, like the perfect plugin EQ, right? Like, because, yeah, like, I think there's all those different components inside of the devices. I mean, I'm saying this as someone who doesn't really understand the gear myself, but I'm guessing that it has to do with all of those different components inside that are kind of just accumulating and giving it its extra little thing. Like, you know, if it's an extra distortion or whatever that is there subtly, but it adds like an extra pleasing quality to the ear, I'm guessing. Would you agree with that, or am I way off there?
That's part of the story, probably. And then the other part, I just don't know what to say. I mean, seems to be more of a mystery, because I try to be objective. I try to measure everything I can, and I have friends who kind of think that I should be able to measure everything. And when I can't, they cause me to think that, okay, well, maybe this isn't such a big deal that I have the Class A amps here, because I could make the same measurable performance with the plugin and so on. I don't know. This was not the best replies of all times, maybe, but
it's interesting. It is interesting to understand, like, you know, it kind of sounds to me also like there's different ways that you can approach your design, right? Like, you might want to have something that is like perfect, like that is perfection and it has no distortion and all that kind of stuff, or you might be fine with that. And I think you have to just kind of, it sounds like maybe you decide for yourself in the process that, okay, I'm going to let this amount of tolerance happen or that kind of thing. And then that maybe dictates what works for you and for your equipment versus what doesn't make the cut, you know? Maybe I'm wrong in that. Yeah, I mean, it's just something that always comes up, because like I'll have a lot of my students will say, well, really, like, what makes this one EQ different from this one here? Like, aren't they the same? But I think you're right though. Like, it's those extra little like harmonic characters that come out, and you know, sometimes it is just like the way that the cue shape changes as people boost the frequencies or that kind of thing too, right? So that can have a play.
Yeah, obviously the user interface and these kind of peculiarities of simple topologies, they eventually might like fool you thinking that it sounds different, although it might sound the same if you actually had the same user interface as your plugin. But okay, even if we think that some gear actually does sound the same, exactly same as some plugin, then the physical user interface is just so much better that even that is actually pretty good reason to use hardware for many people still.
Yeah, and I guess there's also like, that tactile approach to using gear, a lot of people do really appreciate that because they feel more connected to the moves that they're making and that kind of thing. There is like almost like a psychoacoustic element there too, you know, of just like, you know, I'm adjusting this knob, so something is happening, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
Yeah.
We get fooled so easily.
Yeah. It's interesting. Also. Well, so speaking of the Soma, you mentioned that. I know that you advertise that it has what you call real cue adjustment. And I'm curious to know, what does that mean and why is that important?
The traditional passive EQs never had, except for some custom units, they never had a cue value adjustment which wouldn't affect the boost or cut amount at the same time. I mean, increase the cue and you increase the amount of boost, for example, in all of them, like Pultec or any of the copies and many modern designs. So why does it matter? Well, you lose resolution. You cannot have a lot of like wide range of cues without the boosting amount getting super hard to adjust, or you like losing the available boost at low cues. So if you check, for example, what Pultec does, you get something like, I don't know, can't remember exactly, but like 20 dBs of boost when the Q is high. And then when you reduce the Q to the minimum, then suddenly the maximum you have is like 5. This is now just a crude memory about how it actually is. But you can work around it, and many people are fine. But then if you really want to just change the Q and not the boost at all, then it gets much more complicated suddenly. You have to have a huge amount of relays or switches. Well, actually relays, because there has to be a logic table, how to choose certain inductance and capacitance to create the certain Q and frequency combination. It's no wonder that these kind of EQs were not widely available, because it is just so complicated to make. But I thought that, well, this actually could be commercially valid approach, and it seems that it was.
It's very cool. Yeah, I mean, that again, I guess that comes back to what you were talking about earlier, how you just had some different ideas of what the audio industry was missing, and you found that gap there that you were able to implement into your own equipment, and that's one of the things that separates your gear from a lot of the other ones out there. So, like you said, I think you were the first one that did it, right?
Maybe. Oh,
interesting.
I don't remember it anymore. Which brand was it? But I found once from the internet a picture of a EQ which was made only in a few units for one studio. And that was like maybe end of 70s even, very late for a passive EQ anyway. Maybe early 70s anyway. And it did have a real Q value adjustment, at least for some of the bands. And without relays, it required ridiculously complicated rotary switch system. But someone was crazy enough to do it. I wish I remembered the brand.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love the idea that you can just look at a piece of equipment, dissect it, and then figure out a more streamlined approach to it or optimize it. That's that's a skill right there that I wish I knew. Amazing. Another thing I would love to ask about is tubes. And obviously you build a lot of gear that has tubes. And I think when people think of tubes, a lot of people tend to think of tubes as being something that creates a warm sound, or they associate it with saturation, especially obviously because in the world of guitar amps, people think of tubes as like being the thing that gives you that nice crunchy sound and that kind of stuff. But a lot of your gear tends to be really clean. And so I'm curious to know, like, what makes it so that your gear is so clean using these tubes? Or do people just have the wrong interpretation of what tubes should sound like?
Well, low distortion tube gear has always been around, so it's not that I would be doing something completely novel. But to make low distortion tube gear, you got to have quite beefy tubes. For example, the output tubes in my very mute compressor, which is now no longer made, and some they are pretty much the only option I can imagine from both new old stock and currently made tubes, which has this super low impedance and very high current capability, and are also super linear. And that's the Russian 6H30 Pi. I came across that tube because I was following the high-end community. And there are a couple of manufacturers in the States, especially one of them, who started to use them before anybody else knew about the tube in the West. And they had a Russian CEO or something who had contacts, and he began to import these tubes in the 80s, and then later they became available through Electro Harmonix and Sovtek. And it's really one of a kind tube for linear output stages. Well, then, of course, you can always linearize amplifiers with feedback. Just add stages, add feedback, and you get more linearity. But there are some drawbacks. This is one of those black magic things, perhaps, but I believe that for the most beautiful tube output stage sound, you shouldn't use too much feedback, so that the tubes create the linearity. And if you start to make the stage linear with feedback, the linearity will become very, very different in the bass and mids and highs. So to get kind of mostly even spectrum, you have to pay attention to many other things than just open loop gain and then add ton of feedback. But I have to also tell about the transformers, because tube sound without transformers, it's like, how do you define tube sound? For me, I tend to think that people usually mean gear which has transformers on the signal path, and that's very often much more important than the tubes. So transformers have a very complicated set of nonlinearities and quirks, and I've always used very high quality ones and paid a lot of attention to headroom in the bass, which could be a problem in some designs, and also how high the treble extends. And the Swedish Lundahl makes very, very nice units. And after a while, I noticed that they offer this amorphous core instead of silicon iron core. And I ordered some, and I arranged a blind test. I switched transformers in Soma between these two types, and also in Varimu. And then I asked some of my customers to send me their favorite test tracks, and then we made a blind test. And it was pretty interesting, because actually there was only one of the three customers who really obviously heard the difference, and the descriptions, verbal descriptions about the differences were logical. But the other two couldn't hear it, or when they were doing the test, they were not familiar with all the test tracks, and it was just a bit too difficult. So we are not talking about day and night differences, obviously, but we are talking about something that nobody has ever tried to properly explain in distortion or some simple measurable values, but which is audible. But on the other hand, the differences are very real. You can measure them, but it's not so easy to put them into, for example, distortion values, because transformers can have, for example, very high amounts of distortion on very low levels. That's something people probably don't know. But the hysteresis in transformers causes that, and one of the features in this very low loss amorphous core is that these hysteresis losses are very low, and this one customer was able to spot the amorphous model because it could deliver more low-level information like space. I mean, like reverbs, and that kind of like low-level details. So that was one of the most important experiences in my early career. I understood that there is something.
That's fascinating. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because like it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier of like, you know, how how people listen to things, and what really matters versus what doesn't, and what really makes the biggest difference. And I can see how being a manufacturer, you're constantly fighting that battle of knowing what's the right way to go, because everyone's going to have their own opinion of it, and that's very fascinating. Very, very interesting. And also cool to hear about the low-level distortion thing, because I think you're right. A lot of people think that distortion only comes from high level as well. So I'm glad that you brought that up. I'd love to shift gears a little bit to the digital side of things now. Obviously, Plugin Alliance now has a version of the Soma plugin. And, for a lot of people, that might be their first introduction to your brand's equipment. So I know you might be a little biased because obviously it's your product, but I'm curious to know how you feel the plugin compares to the hardware, and if there are any noticeable differences that you can quickly identify between them.
Well, I cannot hear the differences, I have to say. But that doesn't mean that many customers couldn't. I know quite a lot about the modeling because I got pretty active in checking the different versions, and I was quite critical because I found that this is unlike the Knifonium. This Soma is kind of simple, or let's say there are some things that are simple enough to be modeled with precision, and I required them to do it right, and they did. But it took some time, but it was good that they put the effort to do it right. And but then from the very beginning, I also knew, although I'm not the DSP specialist in any way, I understand something about the problems, and I knew that there are some things that they can never do, and nobody else can do. And I said that from the start, that I know. I sent them measurements and explained about some things happening there, that I think that I don't require this to be perfect, because it's just, I don't know if it's impossible. Maybe in 10 years, who knows? But I knew that it's not possible at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it is important for the sound, that I don't know. But I know that from strictly objective standpoint, it cannot be 100% accurate. But then it's certainly good enough to represent the curves. The curves are perfect. The distortions from the bands are very, very, very close. And the output amplifier also is as close as it can be. And it doesn't alias a lot. So it's very, very, very clean, very good processing. And I'm happy. I'm happy about it. And many of my customers who have the hardware sometimes use the plugin also.
That's very cool.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's a sign that, like, for the majority of the regular users, like if you're using it like a regular person would, you probably are going to get the same results as the hardware, more or less. It's just maybe when you're pushing it a little bit here or there, those kind of things, that maybe you get some differences that are super noticeable, I guess. Right?
Yeah. The interaction between bands, it's quite complicated. And they were able, from the very start, they were able to model the frequency response very well. But how to model the distortion behavior, that would be like totally crazy to do.
It's that damn distortion, man. You keep bringing it up, and that's like the thing that just makes everything complicated, right?
Yeah, because the distortion is not only, it's not simply related to the amount of EQing you are doing, but things start to go complicated when you have two bands close to each other, And especially if one is boosting and one is cutting, then there will be distortion also near 0 dB portion of the curves. And I don't know how that could be done.
I'm sure, like kind of like you alluded to, like maybe at the current moment, that kind of modeling in the plugin world just isn't there. But, obviously technology advances so quickly. So I'm curious to also get your take on that as well. Like, do you think the plugins will catch up or even maybe surpass the quality of hardware at some point?
I have been, let's say, pessimistic. So I've believed for 10 years that soon I will be left without work, but it doesn't seem to be happening. So people still use hardware. 5 years ago, I couldn't believe that the situation has changed so little after all. Hardware is still selling. And I thought that the modelings would be already like pretty close to perfection, but I've learned to understand little by little how unbelievably complicated and processor intensive it is. Like, for example, the Knifonium, obviously it's a complicated machine, but I had this weird comparison idea one day that with today's technology, would really, really close modeling consume more electricity than the real thing? I mean, the real thing is tube technology. It's running very hot. It consumes like more than 100 watts of power to make simple synthesis. But I still think that a very, very good digital model would consume more power, which is kind of laughable. But I think that's the way at the moment.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess the biggest thing when it comes to the digital side of things is there's that recallability. There's like that instantaneous thing that comes with digital software, right? So I think that's why a lot of people gravitate towards it. But you're right. Like, I mean, obviously the physical side of things, when you have the physical hardware, you have the tactile element, you have what is currently the best quality sound, and you have all like the little nuances of the hardware that go into it. And, those things, it's funny that like all these plugins are trying to emulate the hardware, but they're not quite getting there, right?
Yeah, I feel a bit weird about that. I understand the reasons, but more plugin companies should be more into designing something new. It's really boring to have the 10 different modelings of some classic, and they are all bad. Like, why? But then what happens in like look ahead limiting? There's been such a great advances like in the past 5 years. I didn't actually know how good they are before a few years ago. A friend of mine wanted to show me how amazing they have been able to make them nowadays. I was kind of blown away. There is like real development and real research and good spirit, but then there is this let's model everything, and they sometimes don't even try to model. They just do the graphics, and that's pretty much it. All there is. So
for sure. Yeah, I guess it's like, there's the people are sometimes afraid to jump into something new or to tackle a new project and a new technology, that kind of thing. And so from a marketing perspective, it's easier to maybe market, hey, this thing that you already love, like we just made a digital version of it. It's cheaper now. You can have 1 million of them instead of, paying a lot of money for one, that kind of thing. But you're right. The technology is definitely allowing us these days to expand upon what we've had before and, create this new stuff. And, I think it sounds like that's kind of the way you approach your gear. You were talking about how you came into this having new, fresh ideas and we were talking about the real cue adjustments and all that stuff. And it's just stuff that is expanding upon the technology that we already had, and it's giving people something new, and it's just we're creating more tools to use and to create higher quality audio. So I think it's a really interesting time that we're in, because we're going to start to see these evolutions, especially now that people are starting to get tired of having like 50 different emulations of a Knif or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, it's just like we're starting to get into like new advances, and it'll shape the way music is heard, I think. So I think that's probably a good spot to wrap this up. If people want to learn more about you or your company, or even purchase some of your gear, what's the best way for them to do that?
There's a contact form on our website, knifaudio.com, and we have mostly sold directly, and that's the way it's gonna be, because that's the way to create more value to the customer. And so we sell like 90% directly to customers nowadays, but we also can sell through some retailers every now and then. So if people are afraid to order directly, they can also ask pretty much any retailer to deal. But we prefer to sell directly for the value. And more about me. Well, I don't know if there is much to learn. So I haven't kept a blog, or I don't have a podcast or anything like that. But I try to write very generally interesting stuff on my Facebook page, Knif Audio Facebook page, compared to the general way of marketing through Facebook. I think there is actually something worth to check every now and then, because I'm not only trying to sell something, I'm also genuinely very interested in some technical things, and I want to share my experience or observations.
Love that. Yeah, I was even noticing on your Instagram page, you get into a lot of this stuff in there too, and you're sharing ideas of stuff you're working on, and it's definitely fascinating to follow your journey there. So definitely people should check those out. Well, Jonte, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I think it was really interesting to hear your perspective on a lot of this stuff, and give people a sense of why this gear is different, why it's important, what people should be listening for. And I love the work that you're doing. So keep up the great work.
Thanks. It was great.
So that was my conversation with Jonte Knif, and that was a really interesting conversation to me. And I think it brought up some topics that I just never even considered when it came to manufacturing. And, that balance of really trying to determine what sounds good, that's a really tough question to answer. And I can see how, as a manufacturer, when you're testing out different components against each other, or making different schematics and that kind of stuff, really understanding what ultimately sounds the best is such a subjective thing. So I can't imagine what it's like to go through that process, but I really appreciate how transparent he was throughout this whole conversation about the battles that he goes through with this stuff and how he balances that. And I also thought it was interesting that he talked about how he isn't a mastering engineer. He's certainly learning that process, but that wasn't his background. So it definitely brings a different perspective to building equipment. And, there's always that battle of pleasing the pro audio community versus the audiophile community, and also just learning how both sides of the spectrum work, and, building equipment that really satisfies a need for both. So I really enjoyed that. I thought it was a pleasure to chat with him and to hear his perspectives and to get his transparency. I really enjoyed that. And I hope that you enjoyed that as well. And if you did, make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. And also make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com if you're looking for tips on how to create pro sounding recordings from your home studio. If you're not sure how to use the equipment, or you're not sure what process you should take, what steps you should take, what you should be listening for, all of that kind of stuff, on that website, I've got a ton of great resources designed to help make the process of recording, editing, and mixing your music easy. And one resource that I definitely want to point you to is my book called The Mixing Mindset. And inside of that book, I break down the entire process of mixing step by step so that you know exactly what to do, what order to follow, and just to take out all of the guesswork throughout the whole process so that you can have fun doing it and you can make better sounding music and ultimately feel proud of the music that you're making as well. So once again, check that out. It's called The Mixing Mindset, and that's available at MasterYourMix.com. So that's it, guys. We've reached the end of this episode, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Have a good one. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@MasterYourMix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.